Christine. Good evening, I'm Isabel Murray, and on behalf of the Board of Irish Network DC, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar hosted by INDC to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the publication of Ulysses on February 2nd, 1922, in Paris by Sylvia Beach from Baltimore, who was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister. What would he have thought? Tonight we welcome Ambassador Dan Mulhall. In addition to his diplomatic accomplishments spanning a more than 40-year career in Ireland's Foreign Service, the ambassador is also an historian and a literary scholar. His new book, A Reader's Guide to Ulysses, has been described as cleverly decoding all 18 chapters. It's a wonderful book, and as you read it, you will have many now I see moments. And I have it on good authority that the ambassador has been granting dispensations to skip over some of the hard bits. The ambassador employs Irish poetry and literature every single day in his work. He uses them as valuable instruments of diplomacy, and it's extraordinary to think that a book that was regarded with so much opprobrium as a scandalous publication in James Joyce's hometown of Dublin has now become Ireland's most recognisable literary export all over the world. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A box during the course of tonight's discussion, so please do that, and our host Cóilín will incorporate them into the discussion as it unfolds. As indicated, our host and moderator this evening is Dr. Cóilín Parsons, who is Director of the Global Irish Studies Initiative at Georgetown University. He is himself an award-winning author and a Joycean scholar in his own right. Joyce scholars are much in demand this week, as you might imagine, and we are very grateful for his own willingness to find this precious hour to discuss this wonderful time. You'll hear also at the end from new INDC Chair, Christine McCann. So please stay tuned, because Christine will give you a preview of our upcoming events as we start to approach something like normal times again. So stay tuned for a wonderful discussion, and over to you now, Cóilín, with our thanks.
Thanks, Isabel, and thanks, Christine. Nice to see you both. If only, there's the usual thing that we would say on an occasion like this. If only we could be here in person and meet all of the people who are here in the audience. You're very welcome. I'm delighted to have taken part in this, and I'm really pleased that I can be part of an Irish Network DC event like this. And I'm very much looking forward to getting back together in person here in DC. So I hope that happens pretty soon. I am in awe of Dan Mulhall's book, and we're going to spend our sort of birthday celebrations this evening concentrating on this very beautiful, there's a pencil sticking out. That's just to prove that I read it and took notes, and it's a pencil. This very beautiful new book from Dan Mulhall, Ulysses, a reader's guide, or Ulysses, a reader's Odyssey. That's important, that part. It is a brilliant achievement. I've devoured it in the last few days. I just got it last week, and I have enjoyed it thoroughly. I think I could say that it's a page turner, Dan. It really is. And by the way, you do not have permission, if you do buy the book, and you should buy the book, you don't have permission to skip any of the chapters, only of Ulysses. While the Centenary of Ulysses is on Wednesday, the 2nd of February, so the 2nd of February 1922 was Joyce's 40th birthday, which makes us all feel inadequate. But while the centenary is on Wednesday, today is also an important day in the publication of history of Ulysses, because it is the last day on which Joyce made corrections. So he was correcting the proofs right up until 2 days before the book was published. And the result, of course, as Joyce scholars will know, is that there were many, many errors in the book as it was first published. And they have kept scholars busy for the last 100 years or so, and hopefully for another 100 years. It was such a rushed affair, but we can't say that of the book that we're going to discuss today. Dan, first of all, congratulations. This really, and I know while Isabel said that we're all, Joyceans are busy this week, nobody's as busy as you to have this book coming out on the birthday. Yeah. And I guess I could start with a question really about what your relationship is with Ulysses. How did it begin? What's your own history?
Yeah, well, I went to a Christian Brothers school in Waterford.
Where they taught Ulysses?
No, they didn't actually, as it happens. But we had a very radical, I suppose he was, teacher in my 5th year at school. And he organized a little reading circle to read this notorious novel. I intended to be at the second session of this reading circle, but it was closed down after the first because the brothers got wind of it, and that was the end of that. And this teacher ended up making his way off to another school where the brothers felt his talents would be more readily appreciated than they were in Mount Sion in Waterford in those days. So and I studied literature and history at UCC, as you know, and I studied the portrait of the artist as a young man. And in fact, I wrote an undergraduate essay about the Christmas dinner scene in A Portrait, where you have Dante Reardon, who's also mentioned in Ulysses, and Joyce's father, known as Simon Dedalus in A Portrait and also in Ulysses. And I just love that segment of A Portrait, and I wrote about it in one of my undergraduate essays. And then in 1974, I made my way across the Atlantic, my first time outside of Ireland, really, other than once with my parents. We visited Torquay in Devon, where we went to visit some friends of theirs who had settled there. But other than that, this was my first time really outside of Ireland. I was 19 at the time. And I was staying at a Jesuit university in Kansas City called Rockhurst University. It's a thriving place. I was there. I went back there recently, and they rolled out the red carpet for me because my status had changed quite a bit since my first time staying there. But across the street from Rockhurst is the University of Kansas City, University of Missouri, Kansas City, UMKC. And I went in there, and in the bookshop, I saw a copy of Joyce's novel, and I bought it. And I brought it home that evening, and I was staying in rooms in the university during the summer, and I read it. And the first 2 chapters were fine. I thought, well, what's the fuss about? Why are people so, alarmed by this book? Why are they so intimidated by it? Why don't they teach it at UCC, as they did not do in those days, for undergraduates at least? And then I got to episode 3, Ineluctable Modality of the Visible. Well, even now I have to consult a dictionary, and luckily you have an online dictionary that makes you're able to kind of somehow understand what it means. But that's sand in your eye kind of chapter. It's kind of, I say in the book that it's like as if they put Beecher's Brook as the third fence in the Grand National. In order, you feel that Joyce put that chapter there in order to intimidate his readers and to make sure that only the sort of, the strong at heart would actually proceed beyond that, episode. So yeah, that's when I started with the book. And then, I brought the book with, I carried the book home. I didn't throw it away. When I went to India, I had it bound in leather, and I still have the book, and here it is now, right? Leather bound, my 1974 American edition of James Joyce's Ulysses, and here it is. And I've been mulling over this book ever since. Not consistently until the last few years, but especially when I went to Edinburgh in 1998, and I was about to host my first Bloomsday, and I had people there, like I had Alistair Gray, the author of Lanark, was there reading. I had Owen Dudley Edwards, the great Irish historian and really great character. I had a whole host of really prominent Scots. Bernard McLaverty was there as well. So I felt I really needed, and I did that year. I really, my first proper serious reading of the book, from cover to cover, because I knew I'd have to up my game if I was going to compete with the people that I was going to be reading with. And I remember that day, Alistair Gray, shall we say, he had a few glasses too many of the Burgundy that we served, but he did a wonderful reading of the Carlyle parody in Auction of the Sun. And he did it, of course, in his sort of very strong Scottish accent, and it just sounded perfect, you know, even though he himself was in his cups at the time. But didn't matter. He was well able to deliver this version of Joyce's mimicry, or Joyce's parody of Carlyle. So that's really when my kind of serious journey with the book started. And ever since then, I've hosted Bloomsday events all over the world, and they've always been A, great fun. I've really enjoyed them, and B, I think they've managed to convey a sense of the novel to people that otherwise might have been intimidated by it.
And so when you moved to the US in 2018, right?
17.
2017, but you started this blog on the Ambassador's blog about Ulysses in 2018 or so. What inspired you to pick up pen, as it were, at this point, after 40 years or more of an engagement with the book?
You know, I was conscious of the centenary looming, right? I'm inspired by centenaries because they give you a target, right? It's a date. And if you don't meet the date, you're not going to, get there. So my first book, A New Day Dawning, was about Ireland in 1900, and I published it in 1999 for the millennium. My second book, The Shaping of Modern Ireland, a set of essays on that subject, was done for the centenary of the Easter Rising. And this one is done for the centenary of the publication of Ulysses. So what happened was, traveling around America, visiting places like Notre Dame, Georgetown, indeed, New York Public Library, Emory, almost Notre Dame, every university I've been to where I've been shown their special collections, you see a first edition of Ulysses, right? It's like the crown jewels. That's what. And I've seen so many of them and then the other thing, the main thing that prompted me to do this was going to the Rosenbach Museum to take part in their Bloomsday celebration in 2018. And at the Rosenbach, where the original manuscript is located, they close off the street outside, and they have a day-long celebration of the novel with 10 hours of readings and music associated with Ulysses. And it's marvelous. And I remember thinking, hey, if they can attract 1,000 Philadelphians on a summer's day to come to listen to this book being read, this is a book that's really powerful as a statement of something about Ireland. And I wanted to celebrate that. So I started the blog thinking I might publish it as a book. And then I thought, no, it's not going to work because I'm never going to get it finished in time to publish it by 2022. And therefore, the moment would have passed. It would never be published. And then the pandemic came along. And I went from being out 6 nights a week for the previous 12 years to being out no nights a week for about a year. So it gave me time to get to work and to really polish it up. And I rewrote all of the blogs extensively. I mean, the blogs bear little resemblance. I mean, there's some you can recognize some similarities, but they're very different from the original blogs are very different from the final product. So I guess the pandemic gave me the incentive to get it done and to publish it ahead of the centenary of the publication of the novel in Paris on the 2nd of February, 1922.
I mean, some of us had sourdough starters and some of us drank cocktails. You're writing a book.
Yeah. Me, I'm afraid. That's me. I'm afraid. My alcohol consumption went down dramatically in the course of the year, but my writing went up greatly.
How's your sourdough
Twins and roundabout
going?
Sorry. Yeah.
Well, you very modestly call it a turning of the sod rather than a full excavation of the book. I love that. I love that phrase. There's a sort of a sense of, sort of turning something over and discovering it and uncovering it. And I thought maybe actually it would be great for us to hear from you, read a little bit from the book, to get a sense of what it is that you uncover when you turned that sod.
Well, I mean, this is like this is a bit that is set in America in 2021, and it's about the inauguration and so forth. It's not typical maybe of the rest of the book, because the book, it has a first chapter which is a kind of a memoir of my experience of traveling around the world with this novel and other Irish literary texts as my kind of traveling companions. And then there's also a Q&A chapter which is based on a lecture I gave down at West Palm Beach at a very exclusive rare bookshop down there a few years ago, just before the pandemic actually hit us. And then there's 18 chapters, one on each of the episodes of Ulysses. And then there's a final chapter called The Parting Glass, last words on Ulysses. But, you know, each of the chapters on the episodes of Joyce's novel, they don't seek to, you know, explain every single thing. They sort of, their commentaries, their reflections, their meditations on the novel, and they have, you know, elements of my own experience of living with this novel for the last 40 years. But this is the last page of the introductory chapter. It's headed America 2021. On 20 January 2021, 80 years after the death of James Joyce in January 1941, shortly after he had met with Sean Lester, an Irish diplomat based in Geneva, I attended the inauguration of America's 46th president, Joseph R. Biden Jr. His election in November 2020 had been widely welcomed in Ireland. That was due to the manner in which President Biden has consistently highlighted his Irish heritage. He is the most Irish president of the USA since John F. Kennedy, and has a reputation for frequently quoting Irish poets. President Biden has often said, "I don't quote Irish poets because I'm Irish. I quote them because they're the best poets." He released a powerful campaign video of his reading of Seamus Heaney's The Cure at Troy, which served further to highlight the president's affinity with Ireland, as well as the enduring appeal of our literature. Speaking on arrival in Britain as part of his first overseas trip, President Biden quoted those memorable lines from Yeats's Easter 1916, "All change utterly, a terrible beauty is born." When then President-elect Biden left his home in Delaware on 19 January to travel to Washington for his inauguration the following day, he quoted James Joyce's comment to the effect that when he died, Dublin would be written on his heart. President Biden remarked that in his case, Delaware, where he had lived most of his life, would be written on his heart. At such an emotional moment in his life, when he was on the verge of entering into the highest office in the land, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. quoted James Augustine Joyce. Enough said. So that's kind of an example, I suppose, of how in the book I've tried to weave in my experience of representing Ireland around the world. I tell stories from different parts of my career to illustrate some of the points I want to make, essentially about the value that literature has for Ireland in introducing us to audiences around the world who would otherwise perhaps have no affinity or no affiliation with our country.
I think at one point you described the book as being entangled with its history, which I think is a beautiful way of describing it. And that actually leads me. Before I ask another question, I should remember to invite you to put questions in the Q&A box. Down the bottom of your screen, you should see a little link as Q&A. Just throw us a question. I will get to as many as I can. I know that Dan is very keen to hear from the audience and to answer questions. So just a reminder, I see a couple of them coming in right now, so I'll look at them and get to them. Dan, before I sort of go to that question really about the sort of the diplomatic work that the book does for you, I wanted to, in your reader's Odyssey, you make no bones about which episodes you like and which episodes you do not like. Yeah. And there's one that is a particular favorite with you, and I love that you borrow that description, or that saying from Ezra Pound. He says, "The excuse for parts of Ulysses is the whole of Ulysses." So while you might not like some parts of it, the whole thing together is an extraordinary achievement. So I know that you're very fond of the Cyclops chapter, and I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about why that's the one that you zero in on. Yeah. I also thought you were very restrained in only giving it about the same length in your own book as all of the other chapters. Yeah. But you're passionate about the work that chapter does.
Yes, well, first of all, I think it's a very enjoyable chapter, and I think if you're going to immerse yourself in a chapter of a big book, I mean, this is a big book, right? There's a lot to it. In fact, I take the view that you could dig forever into Joyce's novel and never really get to the bottom of it. I just remember actually someone quoted recently what Anne Enright said about Joyce's novel. You know, don't talk about finishing it. You never finish it, because it never finishes with you, because every time you go back to it, you find new things in the novel. So as I see it, there are different ways in which you can approach it. In the book, I say, well, you don't have to know about the Homeric elements, the Homeric parallels, but actually you might well decide that you wanted to know about those, and you might well decide that this would give you an incentive to read the Odyssey by Homer, and why not? I also make the point that, there's Joyce's, Plato and Aristotle are there in the, in that chapter in the National Library, Scylla and Charybdis, and they may even be Scylla and Charybdis for all we know. We don't know for sure, but they could be. And I said, well, but actually, if you wanted to, use Ulysses as an incentive to go and study Greek philosophy, why not? So for me, at least, my entry point to the book, when I read it as a work of fiction, but with strongly embedded in the history of Ireland at a particular time in our history. And that time was, as I put it, it was a cusp in Irish history. I mean, most people couldn't name an event in Irish history that happened in 1904. But if you do your maths, it's about halfway between the fall of Parnell in 1891 and the Easter Rising. So I see it, at least in one sense, as a kind of an elegy for the departure, for the failure of the Parnellite experiment in delivering home rule to Ireland through agitation in the Parliament in Westminster, and the new world of Irish nationalism represented in the book by Arthur Griffith, who doesn't appear in the book, but he's mentioned many, many times. And he's important because he features in Molly's soliloquy, because she says something to the effect of, well, he says he's the coming man. Well, he doesn't look it, given the state of his trousers. So, Molly can be relied upon to judge people in her own inimitable way, shall we say. So I do think that there is a kind of a lot to be gained from a reading of the Cyclops chapter as someone who has a background and a fascination with Irish history, as I do. But apart from that, it is very entertaining. First of all, the dialogue is marvelous. I have a thirst on me I wouldn't sell for half a crown. I mean, you can hear someone in Dublin saying that. Not now, mind you, the half a crown wouldn't get you very far in a Dublin pub. You'd be thrown out. But the point is that there's a lot of really very, very good dialogue. I mean, there's a wonderful line. I won't quote it all because it's a bit but there's a wonderful line about when one of them complains, hey, those holy boys in Maynooth, they put up pictures of His Majesty's racing colours. Why didn't they put up pictures of his women? Considerations of space influenced their lordship's decision. So there's a wonderful humor. There's a wonderful humor in that chapter. And then I love these wonderful asides, when he goes off. I mean, for no particular reason, he just launches into a kind of a grandiose Swiftian kind of 4 or 5 pages of lists and extraordinary diversions from the actual substance of the chapter and the novel. So I love the kind of the vituperative views that come across there. I mean, it's a lampoon, of course. It's extremely unfair, I think, to Michael Cusack, because it presents him as an anti-Semite. I don't know that he was. I mean, there was a lot of anti-Semitism around at that time, of course. So you can't exclude that he was, and Arthur Griffith certainly, was guilty in that area. But I mean, the fact is that Michael Cusack, the founder of the GAA, was a colourful character, no doubt, and he did call himself Citizen Cusack. So, but I suspect that the reason Joyce decided to use him to lampoon was because he was safely dead, and therefore he couldn't have taken any kind of legal action against the book. Whereas I have this notion that the real target of the book is someone like D.P. Moran, who was a great Irish Irelander and an advocate of Catholic Gaelic Ireland, and nothing else would do him. But he, of course, was very much alive in 1922 and would certainly have been highly litigious. And I dare say Joyce probably felt it was safer to choose. And also, of course, Moran was less colorful as a character than Citizen Cusack. But nonetheless, it is over the top, but I kind of like the over the top element of it. And in my first Bloomsday in Edinburgh in 1999, that section was read. The list, the litany of all the heroes and the ancient heroes and heroines of Ireland was read by Owen Dudley Edwards, who's the most magnificent reader. You probably know him. He's a wonderful character. He read it at about 150 miles an hour, and he read about 10 pages, but with the most extraordinary speed you've ever heard, and didn't miss a beat. So I've turned that passage into my party piece, which I've read all over the world in the years since I left Scotland. And I'm not as good as Owen, but I do enjoy reading about the those ancient heroes and heroines of Ireland, who include Benjamin Franklin and God knows who else, little Tom Cobley and all, really. But it's a wonderfully
man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo.
The man aboard the bank at Monte Carlo.
The woman who didn't.
The woman in the Gap, and
it's a great passage.
People, and then Don Sullivan. Don something O'Sullivan Bear. That's right. Yeah. It's a wonderful list. Some of them are validly Irish and validly heroic. Others of them are highly obscure. Like I did a recent Sunday Miscellany piece about two characters who appear there. Boss Croker, who was a Tammany Hall boss, who moved back to Ireland and became a major figure in Ireland in the early part of the century. And then Peg Woffington, who was an 18th century Irish actress who was famous on the stage in London and Paris, and in fact, I surmised that maybe she might have been one of the inspirations behind Molly Bloom.
It's a great. Having read the book, it's a great piece. So that's a Sunday Miscellany piece, is well worth listening to, especially on Peg Woffington, is a fascinating character. I'll turn to a couple of questions from the audience right now, and actually, this is a good place to ask a question that sort of comes from in two different ways, one anonymous attendee and one from Donald, which really asks about the experience of reading the novel. One of them asks, do you think the notorious difficulty of reading, what do you think of the notorious difficulty of reading Ulysses? Do you think Joyce was showing off? I think, in one sense, obviously in Cyclops, yes, indeed. Or do you think it's not as difficult as its reputation? And then I'll sort of append the next question from Donald, which is, do you recommend attempting to stumble through Ulysses first and then find redemption with your book? Or to start with your book as a precursor to tackling Ulysses itself? A great description.
Well, the second one, I think I definitely want you to start with my book, because, you mightn't get to the end of Ulysses and then you might decide you didn't need to read my book. So read my book first, and then I hope it will inspire you to pick up Joyce's novel, which is a rather weightier tome and will take you rather longer, and has got more heft to it, and you'll have to work harder at it. But my book, I hope, will be a relatively straightforward read for most readers, certainly for all members of INDC, anyway, that's for sure. So, sorry, what was the first question again?
It was, what do you think of the difficulty of the book? Was
Well, look, I mean,
it's not as difficult.
Look, I mean, it is difficult, right? It is a difficult book. There's no doubt about that. You have to be willing to put in the effort. It's not, if you're looking for an easy read, it's not for you. But I do think that there are parts of it which are very straightforward. I mean, the first two episodes, I think, are quite easily readable. There are very few challenges there. I think that the fourth episode is very enjoyable. It's very, it's lively, interesting. The fifth, likewise. The sixth, which is full of wonderful graveyard humor, when Leopold Bloom travels to Glasnevin Cemetery for the funeral of the misfortunate Paddy Dignam, who seems to have drunk a bit too much, and therefore, what was it? Simon Dedalus said, many a good man's failing. He says, that he had a few drinks too many, and that was probably what because he died
certainly of Simon Dedalus's own.
Simon Dedalus's own, and I think he died of apoplexy, which could probably be brought on by overindulgence. But anyway, so there's lots of wonderful graveyard humor in that, which I think is marvelous. I do think that chapter 8, the Laestrygonians, where he goes to Davy Byrne's pub is it's a good read too. And then I think chapter 10 is actually the easiest of all to read, really, because it's like 13 quite short passages which focus on different bits of life in Dublin in June of 1904, and I think it's a very good read. And then I recommend highly Cyclops, although it is a difficult read in some ways, but it's an enjoyable read, and I think that most readers will be able to get on top of it. So undoubtedly, Ulysses is a difficult read. There's no doubt about that. It's a difficult book to read, but I do think it's worth the effort because it's a book that repays. It's a bit like learning a difficult language. The more you put into it, the more you get out in terms of understanding. And there's a lot there that I think is worth bearing with. It's worth going along with, to sort of, because the journey, I think, is a very interesting journey for any serious reader. And I certainly, that's why I call the book A Reader's Odyssey, because I make it clear that I'm also a journeyman when it comes to this book, rather than the ultimate expert on the content and the significance of Joyce's work. That's why I refer to it as a turning of the sod rather than a deep excavation, because I think you could go deeper. And I do approve of academics, by the way, who go deeper, because I think it's necessary for academics to go deeper in order to find those hidden bits. Because I say it's not a detective story where you have to understand all the bits of chapter 3 before you go on to chapter 4, because there are clues that you need to build on. No, you don't have to do that, but there are clues there, because every chapter has something in it that may be hidden. For example, chapter 1, episode 1, there's a reference to Mulligan talks about his friend Bannon, and he's found this photo girl in Mullingar, and you think, well, what's that about? But in episode 4, you realize that the photo girl is actually Molly and Leopold Bloom's daughter, Millie, who is writing to her father from her job at a photographic studio in Mullingar. So she's the photo girl. So there are all sorts of things like that. And there's a lot more than that in it that you have, that if you do read it carefully, it does repay your reading. The more you get into it, the more you find. But not everyone has the time or the inclination to dive deep down and to excavate down to the bottom, if there is a bottom, to the novel. For example, since I finished the book, I've been focusing in particular on the Eumaeus episode, because I wrote a piece about the Phoenix Park murders for the Irish Times a few weeks ago. The Invincibles and Skin the Goat, and the man who runs the Cabman Shelter in the Eumaeus episode may or may not be, probably is, but may not be Skin the Goat, who was the getaway cab driver for the Invincibles, and ended up spending 15 years in prison for his trouble. And I read that again, and the more I read it, the more I saw things that actually I didn't notice when I was writing my blog and then writing my chapter for the book. And the same is true with Ithaca. I've been looking at that again, looking at in conjunction with writing other stuff about Ulysses to promote my book. And the more you read Ithaca is like a novel in itself. It's about 100 pages long, and it's got an extraordinary amount of detail in it. And it could take you forever to actually delve into all this detail, all these references. And you learn in Ithaca more about Leopold Bloom than you learn in the whole of the rest of the book. So that's a chapter which, again, I wasn't a huge fan of in the beginning, but I now see it as really a crucial chapter, and one that bears careful study by the careful reader.
It was writing Ithaca right up to the very end. And so rewriting it even in the last week. I'll turn to another question from the audience. Here's a nice question from Dennis Gallagher in Denver. Thanks for joining us from Denver.
Hi, Denver.
He writes, in the final page of Portrait, Joyce says he wants to spend his life forging, that is, Stephen Dedalus says he wants to spend his life forging the smithy of my soul, the uncreated conscience of my race. Do you believe you did that in your life, reading and writing and speaking about this remarkable book? So that's I could give you an opportunity to be more modest about it, and maybe sort of use that question to open up, you know, what the very, you know, what makes, in a sense, what brings so many people here to our conversation today, what brings so many people to your book, and what brings the book so much attention, is that you have used this, and Yeats, and every Irish poet who's writing right now, as part of a sort of a broad spectrum of a diplomatic engagement with the world. And I guess the question would be, you know, what's that been like? What's the purpose of that been? And you know, how has Ulysses felt adequate or inadequate to the job of representing a modern Ireland?
Well, certainly, you know, the job of a diplomat it's quite diverse. There's a lot to it, and not all of it is in the public square. But one part of it, which is increasingly important these days, is telling Ireland's story. And you know, there are various ways of telling Ireland's story, but you have to find a means, you have to find an instrument for doing it. And I've taken to social media as, you know, a resource really for reminding people that Ireland has a powerful literary tradition. And that's why I started this blog, by the way, and that's why I did a lot on W.B. Yeats in 2015 when I was in London in order to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Yeats's birth. So our writers are an asset to us in telling our story. And the best example that I can give of that is an example I cite in the book, which is when I arrived in Germany in 2009. And at that stage, the clouds were gathering around the Irish economy, like in a big way. I mean, we were really under a lot of pressure economically, and eventually, a year later, we ended up in the EU IMF rescue program, right? And you know, we were in the doghouse a bit. Most Germans at that time thought of Ireland as bad banks. These people were a bit feckless. They had a big party. They overindulged during the Celtic Tiger. Their economy crashed, and now they're looking for us to bail them out again. How dare they? So I thought that a way to respond to that would be to broaden the image of Ireland, to extend the horizon that people would view Ireland through, or the prism through which they would view Ireland through. So we happened to get at the embassy an exhibition that the Department of Foreign Affairs had commissioned on the life and work of W.B. Yeats. So myself and my then deputy, who's now ambassador in Mexico, we decided to declare a year of Yeats. Now, I mean, there was no basis for this, just it's a declaration, but you know, it's fine. And I traveled around to, I think, at least a dozen universities all over Germany, Freiburg, Marburg, you name it. And I opened the exhibition and I gave a lecture. Now, sometimes, you know, 30, 40 people turned up. Other times, 300-400 people turned up. And I always started my lecture by saying, before I talk about Yeats, and I know you heard talk about Yeats, but I want to just tell you, you've probably seen stories about Ireland in the news in the last few years. Here's the story. And I would tell them that, you know, our economy is fundamentally sound. We would recover. Any money we borrowed, we would pay it back. And we would soon be back in good shape again because we had a fundamentally sound economy, and we're going to be able to navigate our way out of this crisis. So here was an example of how, if you like, I used Yeats, I used our literature to get an audience for a message that maybe if you offer that message on its own, people would have recoiled from it and gone away, but they were willing to listen to you, what you had to say, because you were giving them something that they wanted to be associated with, which was a lecture on you know, a famous Irish poet. And I also, when I went to those universities, I would always insist, I would talk to the people in the Anglistic departments, what they call the English departments in Germany. I'd say, introduce me to your economics department, to your business department, and I want to talk to them as well. And I would meet those people, and they would generally be commentators on economic affairs and local radio. So I felt I was reaching people with my message that I wouldn't have been able to reach had it not been for the fact that I was able to front up with a lecture on W.B. Yeats.
I think Joyce would appreciate the Trojan horse aspect of that, the modernization of a Hellenic story. Are there, when you think about that, so you can see, that Yeats in Germany staged a sort of a series of felicitous encounters. One of the things that makes this book so enjoyable is that it's also a story of your almost 50-year-long affair with the novel, and I love the serendipitous details that are sprinkled throughout it. And as I was reading it, I was wondering whether there were places where you encountered difficulty in sort of, introducing them to Ulysses, or whether Ulysses played better in one place or another place, whether it was more difficult to tell that story. The US is obviously this is fertile soil. The US, of course, is essentially the place where Ulysses took off as a classic.
Yeah, exactly.
When it was barely available in Europe. But what, were there places where you encountered resistance or difficulty in bringing that book to them?
Well, you see, I had to, everywhere I've been, you have to pitch it differently. So in Malaysia, for example, there was a challenge there because Malaysia is an Islamic country and they have very strict censorship laws. So, for example, on one occasion, when we brought the movie Bloom, the most recent film version of Ulysses, we brought it to Malaysia and we couldn't show it in a local cinema because the censor would have just gone sort of apoplectic with and would have cut it to ribbons. So we had to show it at the embassy, and obviously we had to choose our audience carefully. Now, in Malaysia, it wasn't difficult. Most of the people we knew were people who were perfectly interested in and wanted to and were keen to see this movie because they wouldn't be able to see it in a cinema in Kuala Lumpur or anywhere else in Malaysia. So you had to pitch carefully. So in Malaysia, there I focused on the English language, because one of my main jobs there was to promote Irish education for Malaysian students, because our universities were benefiting greatly from having Malaysian students study. So to be able to kind of present Ireland as a home of a really distinguished literary tradition was a plus for us. So I, for example, I organized a literary competition, in order to, and every year I would write about Bloomsday in the New Straits Times or in the Star newspaper, which is a Chinese newspaper in English, and I would always have to pitch it carefully to sort of to present it and to avoid, like, I wouldn't talk about Molly Bloom's soliloquy, for example, in the New Straits Times, because that would probably not meet their requirements. So I had to navigate carefully to make sure that I could present the novel. And then in Germany, I always presented the Cyclops chapter there, and in particular, Bloom's definition of his nation. Ireland, I was born here, Ireland. And I said to them, that definition, had it been accepted here in Germany, could have spared you a lot of bother during the 20th century, because, of course, the Germans took a different view of nationality during the Nazi era, and people who were born, and even their parents and grandparents born in Germany, ended up being persecuted and killed by the Nazi regime because they didn't meet other criteria for membership of the German nation.
There's a series that, in a way, that this leads us to a series of questions, a few questions in the Q&A, and I have all that look forward to sort of the next 10, 20, 100 years. I'm not going to ask you to, be a Yeatsian here and imagine, sort of have a seance and see what the future of Ulysses looks like. But in a sense, Ulysses came into the world so fleetingly, so awkwardly. It was difficult to publish. It wasn't widely available. It was, as you point out, extremely expensive. I think you tell the story of George Bernard Shaw writing to Sylvia Beach saying, as an ordinary Irishman, I can't afford this. Actually, it was Terence Cóilín actually writing in the Irish Times today was talking about that as well. So there's enormous effort put into making what it is now. And I'm wondering, like, this is sort of an impossible question, but I'm wondering, like, what do Ulysses's next 100 years look like? Like, what where might this novel go? And I could make it a slightly easier question by asking it in the way that Ted Smith asks it. Hi there, Ted. Ted asks, if Joyce were writing Ulysses today, what issues or themes would most engage him? If Bloom were to be the everyman of this moment of 2022, what would engage him? So there's a sort of a few questions there about, it's 100 years old now. And as you say, centenaries are a great opportunity, not only to look back, but to imagine what the next 100 years would look like. What do you think they'd look like for Ulysses?
Well, I've been writing recently a bit about, and maybe one of these essays may appear in the coming days, but I've been writing a bit about Leopold Bloom as a man for our times. And I'm kind of making the point that, especially, and the line that I quote most is, when he sort of, this really, the first 11 episodes of the novel, Bloom is he's like a mouse. He's a pipsqueak. He doesn't say anything. He's very careful, prudent. He kind of keeps to himself. He kind of dodges out. When he meets kind of, boring people on the street, he talks to them civilly and then he sort of dismisses them afterwards. But he's very kind of diffident and understated and careful and so, and then in the Cyclops episode, another reason why I like that episode is that, the mouse starts to roar. And and then from then on, he's much more assertive, really, in a way, and that he actually sort of, I mean, in the Eumaeus episode, he expresses himself, and then in the Ethica episode, you hear much more about what he stands for and so on. So, but the point is that he says, perpetuating national hatred between nations, that's not life. He says, force, hatred, history, and all that is no life for man and woman. Well, it's the opposite of that is really life. And then Alf says, what do you mean? And he says, I mean love, the opposite of hatred. So, I mean, given the extent to which in today's world, not everywhere, of course, but there's a lot of prejudice, there's a lot of one-eyed opinion going around the place, there's a lot of the kind of stuff that Bloom complained about. And I have this feeling that Bloom is a man for our times too, and his appeal for a more, he talks about the need to look at both sides of the argument, to weigh things up. So he's a kind of a careful, he's not a huge intellectual, he's not a Stephen Dedalus, he's not a James Joyce, he's not a deep thinker, but he tries hard. He tries to figure out the world around him, and he tries to make up his own mind about it. He doesn't go, I mean, it says in the Ithaca chapter, for example, that both he and Stephen, both Bloom and Stephen, were resistant to established ideas, that they had heterodox opinions. In other words, he wasn't prepared to go with the crowd and just be one of the lads. He was, and in the Cyclops chapter, he stands out against that and says, no, that's not the kind of world we want. And I think that Mr. Cautious Calmer, as he's called elsewhere in the novel, is really a person that we might look to these days to calm the discourse in our own time. So looking forward, I have a feeling that a bit like, the way the Second Coming, I've written about this recently as well, Second Coming, it comes again and again and again because it seems to have, I mean, like I tweeted from the Second Coming just by accident, really, or whatever, late in 2020 or thereabouts, in the height of the pandemic, and everyone thought the poem was about the pandemic. It got retweeted again and again and again because it seemed to capture the moment. People were feeling that way. They were feeling, put upon. They were feeling that there was some kind of apocalypse, around us. And the same, I think, is true. I think those kind of values that Bloom exhibits and expresses in his in the second half of the novel, when he kind of comes alive, it's almost as if he comes alive after Blazes Boylan has had his assignation with Molly. That after that he seems to he kind of falls apart in some ways, some of the critics say, but I think he also expresses himself more, and he's more on the ball, he's more assertive, he's pushing back a bit more. I mean, for example, when he hears the litany of complaints about England, that come from Skindergoat Fitzharris in the cabman's shelter at Butt Bridge, he says he poo-poos it as egregious balderdash and says, in fact, like that. So he becomes more opinionated, I think, after he comes to terms somehow with the fact that he has been cuckolded by Mrs. Boylan visiting his wife during the Sirens episode, before he goes to Barnett. Between
Sirens and Cyclops, essentially. I've always found that short piece about love very difficult to read, because on the one hand, it has all of that you put into it, right? All of the sort of complexity of, the calmer, the person who has a sort of capacious understanding. On the other hand, there's a sort of an emptiness to the phrase too, right? There's a weird sort of like love, the opposite of hatred. That's almost like a John Lennon emptiness to it. And there's an interesting way that Bloom sort of is both our intellectual and also, is not. It walks around with his head sort of, as George Eliot might say, well wadded about with stupidity in some way. So it's an interesting character for that reason.
I mean, but isn't that life for you? People not.
Isn't that what we are?
I mean, the reason I like Bloom, and I know you're sort of, you think I'm in love with Bloom, but no, I like him because he reminds me of all of us. I mean, he gets his maths wrong, for example. He makes all kinds of mistakes. He can't remember names of. He's wondering about Carey, the Invincible. Oh, is he Patrick or James or Kevin? He can't remember, and he makes all kinds of mistakes, which Joyce puts in deliberately, of course. But that's to show that he's like the rest of us. He's a bit muddled, and his thoughts are not always clear. Most of the time, they're not,
and Stephen obviously has the force of conviction, but conviction about what, we're not sure.
Yeah, and the other thing, the other thing about that bit that I quoted there about the opposite of hatred, love. Then he goes on to Mrs. Thing loves love and love loves love and love loves, and it's kind of like as if he makes a serious point and then he departs from it and makes a joke of it and kind of takes the Mickey out of this kind of serious point. So I think, but isn't that the point, that this is a different kind of novel from what Virginia Woolf might have written. And I have been reading Virginia Woolf at your recommendation. And I mean, I can see brilliant writer in many ways, but not much fun, I mean, like, I never feel any inclination to laugh. What, sorry? I never feel any inclination to laugh when I'm reading Virginia Woolf, whereas I do laugh a lot reading bits of Joyce, because he did have a sort of a good sense of humor. And of course, his father obviously had a wonderful way with words, and I love that line. That Mulligan, he's a counter jumper son, and I'll tickle his catastrophe for him. I'll tell you what, that line, by the way, I discovered is from King Henry.
He'd give you a heartburn on your arse.
Yeah, he give you a heartburn on your arse.
For anybody in the audience who doesn't know, Virginia Woolf had an interesting relationship with the novel, and she described it as being underbred and the work of a queasy undergraduate picking his pimples. At the same time, she admired it. We're coming, I think, to a close here, and I wanted to give, I think everybody in the audience will have a real sense of the sort of capaciousness of your book and the humanity of your reading and your pleasure in Ulysses.
Yeah.
And the way that you actually, evangelize for the novel, as you have done for Irish literature all of these years. But I want to give you an opportunity to share with us maybe a short passage from Ulysses that you might want to read for us.
Okay, well, this is
perfect. And if it's not in the leather-bound volume, we'll be disappointed.
It's here.
There we go. Good.
Okay, but this is one of the pieces of Joyce's writing where he goes into a kind of an extraordinary rapture, if you like, for no particular reason, but it's a wonderful piece of writing. I'm not sure what it really means, but it doesn't matter. It's beautifully written, and it's great to read. In the mild breezes of the west and of the east, the lofty trees wave in different directions their first-class foliage. The wafty sycamore, the Lebanonian cedar, the exalted plane tree, the eugenic eucalyptus, and other ornaments of the arboreal world with which that region is so thoroughly well supplied. Lovely maidens sit in close proximity to the roots of the lovely trees, singing the most lovely songs while they play with all kinds of lovely objects, as for example, golden ingots, silvery fishes, crans of herrings, drafts of eels, codlings, creels of fingerlings, purple sea gems, and playful insects. And heroes voyage from afar to woo them, from Albana to Slieve Margie, the peerless princes of unfettered Munster, and of Connaught the Just, and of smooth, sleek Leinster, and of Cruachan's land, and of Armagh the Splendid, and of the noble district of Boyle, princes, sons of kings. And there rises a shining place whose crystal glittering roof is seen by mariners who traverse the extensive sea in barks built expressly for that purpose. And thither comes all the herds and fatlings and first fruits of that land. For O'Connell Fitzmaurice extolled them, a chieftain descended from chieftains. Thither, the extremely large wains bring foison of the fields, flaskets of cauliflowers, floats of spinach, pineapple, chunks, rangoon beans, strikes of tomatoes, drums of figs, drills of swedes, spherical potatoes, and tallies of iridescent kale, York and Savoy, and trays of onions, pearls of the earth, and punnets of mushrooms, and custard marrows, and fat vetches, and beer, and rape, and red, green, yellow, brown, russet, big, sweet, bitter, ripe, pomellated apples, and chips of strawberries, and sieves of gooseberries, pulpy and plurious, and strawberries fit for princes, and raspberries from their canes. I mean, what was he on when he was doing that? I mean, he obviously was having a great time, and he was thinking, "Hey, it's been banned already. I'm going to have fun with this," you know. Because when I looked at my favorite passage, which is the one with the list of the ancient heroes and heroines of antiquity, the ancient Irish heroes and heroines of antiquity. The list actually in the manuscript in Philadelphia has only got 9 or 10 characters, and they're all like Cóilín and those who that genuinely were
recognizable heroes.
I mean, genuinely were heroes and heroines of Irish antiquity, and the other 80 names were added at the very last moment. So there you have an example of how Joyce just decided at the end, the hell with it. I mean, the book's being published. I have the contract. I can do whatever I like. And no one can stop me. Even Ezra Pound. Remember, Ezra Pound wrote to him and said, "Are you mad in the head? I mean, have you fallen and knocked your head against something? What are you up to? Maybe your book can be published in a Bulgarian or Greek translation sometime, but not in English. Stop it." And then he said, and by the way, he said, and
on this as on everything else, Ezra Pound was wrong.
It was wrong, and Joyce wrote back. He wrote to I think it was Harriet Weaver Shaw saying, or Harriet Shaw Weaver saying, Pound, he's too busy doing other things. He doesn't appreciate how what I'm trying to do here. But Pound said, it's not necessary to have a different method for each chapter. Stick to, and I asked the question as well. Well, why did he not stick to, say, the Cyclops chapter kind of way of doing it? And that could have gone on, but he genuinely wanted to pose a more challenging set of challenges, a more challenging set of reading exercises to his readers to make sure that they were really up for the final assault on the peak, on the Mount Everest peak that is Ulysses.
It is as you point out at the very end of your own book. It is encyclopedic. And for that reason, it's something that we will dip into and dip out of. And I wouldn't accuse you of having written an encyclopedic book, but it is an extraordinary achievement, which brings to the reader so much of the context of the writing and the publication and the world in which Joyce lived. In the most beautiful sort of exciting prose, racy almost, I would say. I think
the first civil servant ever accused of that kind of quality of anyway.
The Ambassador's racy book. Yeah, I think tonight's conversation gives us a real sense of not only the sort of ebullience of Ulysses, but of the ebullience and the excitement of this book. So Dan, congratulations. It's been lovely to talk to you about it. Thanks to everybody who sent us questions. Sorry we didn't get to everything. And thanks finally Isabel and to Christine for inviting Dan and me along to have a discussion. It's been a real pleasure. And again, here's the book. very attractive. Ulysses, A Reader's Odyssey, Daniel Mulhall, and maybe they might put the link to buy it again in the chat. So thanks everybody, really appreciated this. I'm going to hand over to Christine, who I think has some words before we sign off tonight.
Thank you, Cóilín. Can you see me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. My gosh, what a fun and interesting night. And I have no doubt, Ambassador, that this book is going to open the door to a slew of new readers, and perhaps even those of Homer's Odyssey, which is another wonderful one. So thank you to both of you for putting so much effort into this. I would also like to thank Isabel Murray, who put this entire thing together, Quiva Kenny, who is our vice chair and who also does all of our communications work, and INDC member Brigitte Perry, who also provided assistance. In addition, I want to thank everyone who has joined us. We had a really big group tonight, and I know that we had a lot of members from the Irish Network chapters around the country. So I certainly hope that those of you who are in Washington, if you're not a member, join INDC, you can go to our website. We would love to have you. March is coming up, which is a very exciting time for the Irish, as you all know. So we have a number of things coming up, and I'm just going to go through a few. The rest of them are, you'll see the events on our website. On February 5th, which is this Saturday, for those of you in Washington, the Six Nations game is happening. Ireland is playing Wales. So we will be having a watch party at Across the Pond at 8:45 a.m. That starts. On February 12th.
I'll be there.
I know you will. I know you will, Ambassador. On February 12th, there is a Six Nations game against France. That's at 11:45 a.m. also at Across the Pond. And that is also a fundraising event for the crew that is putting on Washington's St. Patrick's Day Parade. So we encourage all of you to come. On February 17th, we will be doing our monthly social at 6:30 p.m. at the Irish Channel. On March 13th, we will all proudly be marching in the parade, and we invite all of you to join us. We'll have more information forthcoming about where we'll be gathering. And on the 20th of March, Foil Arms and Hog is coming to the Lincoln Theater. I have been told this is a hilarious comedy group. That link is not yet up on our website, but it will be very soon. And I look forward to meeting all of you in person, hopefully very soon. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good evening. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.